All right. Welcome everyone. Good morning. Back on our AU eRequesting technical design group. Today is a little bit exciting, really, I think. I'm just about to pop a link in the chat, which is to the scaffold branch of the Fire IG. That's what we're going to be looking through now. So it's in there already, so you can click on it and get prepared so you know where it is, what it looks like. And I'll run through that agenda. So we'll start with what we usually do, which is our usual business, and if there's any other updates, and then go through now around additional features prioritization, our IG design principles, and then really start going into actual fire, walking through an IG, and he's going to take us through the scaffold branch and going through and continuing the discussion we had on our last TDG about those design options, what they look like, and starting to discuss that with this group, because we really want to walk through that in this meeting and provide that location, because I think we want to get to some decision making. At least if we don't do that today, we definitely want to have that be prepared for our next TDG, which is next Tuesday. So it's a walkthrough today and getting some of that feedback, and then going into making some decisions about what we're actually going to be putting in our eRequesting IG next Tuesday. And then we'll review our meeting cadence, what the rest of our meetings are in May, and if that's still, we're still happy to commit to those meetings, and what is going to be the topic of that next meeting, which is next Tuesday. So right on then into our usual business, which would typically be approval of minutes. We're going to have to defer that to our next meeting because there's still a couple of things outstanding on those minutes that need to be added in before we can move to approve them. So we'll defer that. And then we've got actions. Is David or Angus on the line to give us an update on that first action? I don't think they're here yet. All right. So Andy, can you provide an update on those two actions that were on you on adding principles?
Yes, I have successfully completed both of those tasks finally. Please have a read, everyone. And if you have any additional principles that you think need to be incorporated, happy to take those forward.
I'll leave it to you, Andy, to walk through those if you think that's, if you want to do that when we come to, I guess, that in our next agenda item.
Yeah.
So we might again defer the update on that first action because Angus and David aren't here, and we'll look at that in the next meeting. Or if we have time, we can come back to that at the end of this meeting. So let's move on past this one then, which brings us to our additional features prioritization. So did you want to share your screen, Andy, here, or will I continue?
You can continue for the minute. That'd be good.
Right. Can everyone see the Confluence page?
Yes.
So we've got, I think, what is still our top rated one that we talked about in our last technical design group, but I think we're also going to go through what does that look like in the IG today, being request groups, which is now up to something like 23 votes. And as we come down, I think, what are those other ones that were highly rated? We've got consent withdrawal at 15. There is doctor codes and numbers at 11. That one's got a lot of discussion on it. The one on barcodes or QR codes or place, essentially how are we going to do the token that links places, patients and fillers? And I think those appear to be, copy 2 is also there at 11 upvote. And interestingly, 1 downvote. And claim order for fulfillment. So that looks like that's coming in at equal second or third priority at the moment for claim ordering. Okay, assignment of organizational practitioner role with 8 up, 2 down. And then these ones look to have quite low numbers so far. Oh, supporting clinical information. Okay, that's got 11. So I think in terms of our direction today, we're talking through the request groups. Are there any of the other items that are in that additional features prioritization that are in the scaffold to talk through today, Andy?
Yes, they will fall out of that discussion because I've included things like the existing copy to extension, but as the comments that have been raised here are completely valid, and we need to come to a reasonable position on an appropriate way to do that. So I'm sure we'll have some interesting conversation and momentarily around some of that stuff. There's a couple of others that are also covered off, as in the scaffold has an approach, but as we noted last week, it's just an approach. It is not necessarily the approach that's to be taken, but at least it gives us something to throw things at.
All right, are there any comments that people wanted to make on this additional features prioritization? I'll encourage people again to vote on this. And also, if you have an additional feature that's not on this list that you think needs to be added here so that we can include that in the prioritization, pop a comment at the bottom of this page, please, so that we can set that up with a little widget for what that is. All right, so I'll come back to the slides now. So the next topic then is the IG design principles. I think at this point, it probably does make sense for me to stop sharing and for you to take that on, Andy.
Roger. I'm hoping this is the right screen. It looks like the right screen.
Got data model mappings, yep. And yes, that's design principles we can see.
Okay. Feel free to throw your hand up if you've got any questions as I go through it, or just yell out, and I'm sure Danielle will point out to me if anyone's got some questions. So we already have looked at some of these existing design principles, adherence to fire, one that Danielle loves. Compatibility with existing industry implementation approaches to make sure that there is a pathway forward in terms of industry for adoption. Incremental approach to version adoption so that we don't need to get it all right up front. We actually recognize the fact that this is going to increment in capability and value over time. I think this is the start of the new ones. I think there were 3, maybe it's not. Making sure it is actually implementable and it is clinically effective in what we're achieving. If we're actually going backwards from what is available today, it can be very difficult to get the enthusiasm to adopt. So that has to be front and center in our mind, that we're adding value in this. I added one here on patient-centric design. I'm sure David Hickok's going to provide me some commentary on this hopefully soon, but that just tries to cover off obviously why we would be looking to make sure that the patient is positioned as not just an active focus of eRequesting, but actually an active party to be right up there with clinical endpoints in terms of being able to read the information in an appropriate structured form or their appropriate agent, such that they can be an effective collaborator in this interaction. There was something in there around alignment to national architectural approaches, and there's a call out, I'm not sure who made it, to HIE. I haven't said much about HIE because at the moment it's quite unclear what the industry implication is from that. See, in my mind, I have some vision about data being discoverable, not just the requests, but the reports and everything else. So I think certainly worthwhile keeping in mind that that kind of future function is something we should not be steering away from in the work we do. We should be making sure that such outcomes are allowed for, even if we're not building them in today. There was also commentary on trying, I guess this is a bit of nirvana, to make sure that we're not building new problems by solving the existing ones. That's hopefully in the implication kind of description of this, you get some feel for the kinds of things that we're trying to cover off. I don't know whether this is ever going to be able to be met 100%, but you know, taking the roadway forward, we are going to, I think, end up introducing some challenges for ourselves in doing it, but maybe they're good challenges to have. Any questions, anyone, about those? As Danielle said, do feel free to add commentary down here and chuck in additional starting words or starting sentences from which we can build new principles if you have a strong desire around a particular topic. Okay, Daniel talked about with the features. I do believe that, and it's really good to see the commentary here. I do believe I've probably taken a few of these with me on the journey of request groups. I did that, not, well, could say because I'm lazy, but I kind of was there, and some of even the ones that had lower votes, we have talked about ways of doing it for a while now, so I threw those in just because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. Some of them are a bit harder, and even though they might have been further up the voting, but it's not to say we're not doing them. It was just I kind of took the path of least resistance as I was adding some stuff around groups. The kind of way I went around it was, as we've talked over the last couple of weeks around the data model work, I've tried to take the elements, the FHIR elements that we kind of recognized were somewhere in our kind of focus, and I've tried to include as many of these in the scaffold as I could. Once you start getting into the actual implementation detail, of course, all of the curly bits become far more obvious, unfortunately. The other thing is, at this stage, don't get too hung up with must support in any of this. I just followed my nose. I'm happy to have that conversation. I think we should all have that conversation eventually, but these are just placeholders for a minute. I guess I'd more say that the thing we should look at now is this the appropriate vehicle for taking this concept forward in the IG. Do you want to have a look at another one? I'm not precious about this. And I think that if we can have a robust discussion, we'll all be the better for it. I think I did most of these. I think from memory, I put specimen in there as well. These I put Rule 3 exemption. Vince, I haven't put the S4B exemption, but I'm happy to take some guidance on some of that. I put in urgent result contact. I haven't done much around separation of modality and laterality in the coding, but we have a starting point for that kind of stuff. You will see communication requests in there. I didn't put communication to patient as yet, communication with patient. I didn't put any of the supporting information in, given our kind of recent CDG kind of discussions as yet. Okay, so you should see a good amount of these in there. As someone noted, I think in some commentary around patient consent, consent associated with genetic testing, absolutely an issue. And we do need to kind of potentially create, I think, another profile ancestor, sibling to maybe pathology and radiology to carry some of the more unique genetic testing attributes that we may need in future. All right, I'm hoping that a couple of you, and I know at least one, I know Angus looked at it because he made me change something this week. So some of you have hopefully looked at the scaffold. In case you get a little confused, the easiest way to find it, I find, is through just looking at the branches of the standard. So normally you're just going to go in with the standard eRequesting. So this is going to give you the kind of the master one. Whereas if you want to get to the scaffold, then just go in via the branches, and that'll give you a set of branches. You can go down. Scaffolds this one. It's got a few extra things in now. And if you go into the artifacts, you will see things like, for instance, it now does have a claim operation defined. We'll have a look at that. It's also got a search parameter on the controversial copy twos that we need to talk about. So let's go back to our profiles. This diagram is not current, given I made some changes in the last couple of weeks and I haven't updated the diagram, but if anyone loves doing draw IO pictures or any other means you want, feel free to submit a PR with a new diagram. I will get around to it eventually. So this looks a little different, I think, than what we had before. I'll jump around the place here, maybe, just because some of the things are a little bit more isolated than others. So a big part of my last 2 weeks was actually figuring out how to actually render this. So and I don't know this is the correct way to do it. I think Danielle might have some alternative theories on this, but so I've split service request up into a hierarchy. The top is something called the diagnostic request base. So diagnostic request base is an abstract profile, so it's never meant to be directly used. And it is aimed at being shared across pathology and radiology. So anything that is common for all diagnostic requesting should end up in this box. I should say that last week, I think from the discussion we had agreed that we would use a service request as a grouper for a set of tests or services to be performed for radiology. I think that's where we ended up, and at least agreed that we should have a look at it. So this is my take on it. There's really a couple of ways this hierarchy could be skinned. I've broken up by pathology and radiology as the next kind of tier down, whereas I think you could probably argue to break it up on group and request, and then under those have pathology and radiology. This to me seemed more straightforward. So it's implying that, for instance, for pathology request base, that is shared both for a pathology request group. So in the picture last week we had where each individual pathology test was associated with a group. This pathology request group is the entity that holds that. And this is an individual pathology request or pathology test. They are both share of that common pathology request base. So I put
You
the
have a
rules.
hand up, Andy, from Michael.
Andy, it's Michael. Hey, I was just wondering about that hierarchy and the sort of working out which approach we take there. Is trying to work out what belongs in each of those profiles, because what we're trying to portray at that level, like what sort of information goes in the group versus goes in the service request. I don't think we've really talked through around the role of the group and what it's there to do, and trying to work out, well, I think when we understand what goes in it, then we'll have a better idea of this hierarchy.
Yep, that's a fair comment, and you'll be unsurprised to hear that, like when I did the pathology request group, first, oh, this hasn't been updated. The first thing I did was take out 3 attributes.
Yeah.
And then Angus came back to me and said, why are you taking out category? I don't think it should be taken out. I went, fair call. So I got rid of this, but I don't think that PR is, I thought, Brett.
It got merged. I'm just going to check to see if there's a build failure, if that's what's happened. Or otherwise, if you refresh, it might work. Sometimes when you click through, it'll retain the old.
No, it could be that, it could be my...
Sure.
Anyway, it's a valid point, and I think the discussion last week with is that there's a set of constraints we probably want to apply to this, in that there may be certain things that we want to delegate to the group. So, for instance, you know, part of it is things like if you even look at something simple like the status. So, given we are using service group both for the individual and the group, we now have statuses for the individual elements and a status for the group. What constraints do we want to put on the relationship between those statuses? Should they all be the same? Should they, should the group status be a interpretation that a responsible party applies across the set of children, and therefore it could be different? So you could have children with different statuses, and then the group is some interpretation across those different statuses to say what that means from a placer perspective about the set of requests. We also have to, I think quite separately about the service request. Let's just take pathology for example. So you've got a set of tests being requested within an order, which is represented by the group that is created and controlled by the place of the clinician. They then can be constrained in various ways. And maybe one could argue there is more group constraint on the order than potentially there is in the fulfillment side, but we aim at that placer perspective, then we can go a couple of different ways here. One is we could restrict, as I say, things to group only. So I don't know, let's take an example of the test code, for instance. There really doesn't make much sense in having test codes in a group. So that one's kind of seems all right to take out. Of course,
but I think even like just rolling it up a bit to the role of the group, like what from a places perspective or a filler's perspective, what is the role? What is the group doing? What's it there for? What purpose does it serve? And then that'll help us work out, well, what belongs in there and what's constrained in what way. I don't know that we've really settled on the role of the group and what it's there to do for the different actors.
The on the places side, or I know Ken's going to get into this. On the places side, that the group is the order. It is what is now currently in that paper-based form, in being a holistic set of data associated with the order as it is manifested in the regulatory settings of, requesting in the healthcare sector. Where things in that group potentially make a lot more sense is when, for instance, you have clinical history information and you actually wanted to include clinical history for all tests being requested. Having individual clinical history for individual tests, if you're repeating it, it's a bit redundant across each individual test. Why wouldn't you roll it up and capture it as a whole? It seems to me that having the individual test information being an exception in some ways to the order, the overarching order, would be a lot more efficient way of handling it. Ken, you might have some interesting insights into this.
I mean, you covered the issues that I want to. It's the regulatory issue. So there are groups that are identified by, let's say, the Medicare schedule or individual hospitals. People can request a group of tests, and that may vary from, I'm not sure how we'll define all these different groups, but Medicare will certainly be one of the rules, the grouping rules that we have. And for an extreme of that, in the Medicare review 2016 to 19, they said that they'd have antenatal tests. So the doctor could request for antenatal tests, which are like 12 different tests, which all have different departments, different priorities, it may even be different providers. But they're defined, they're a defined set of tests that are rebatable and orderable, regulatory. But they're also, it's not only sort of what can be defined as a single word, there's also an efficiency issue for the doctor. He'd much rather say, I want to record a national antenatal group than having to spell them out individually or even use the grouping systems in the requesting software to create the group. So I think it revolves around an agreed regulatory definition of that group and the efficiencies to the clinician of being able to request a group and know that it's been standardised and rebatable. And then the exception would come in, like Andy said, if you wanted to add anything to the group, you'd use the individual test to say, well, I also want this.
So is that, say, the antenatal test set, is that then coded?
It doesn't exist at the moment, but that's something that clinicians are asking for in the MBS review, so that they don't have to create the groups in their software. The software differs in their sophistication, being able to create groups of favourites and so on. So clinicians are asking for the grouping, and the government also wanted the grouping to restrict what providers would call that group, because you know, one provider could say, well, I'm going to include in the group a few more tests and you know, increase the cost of the system. So, but it does, it's both regulatory and clinical. I mean, but the clinical, I mean, the grouping will probably be defined clinically by sort of a consensus based, this is what this group contains. But so ultimately it's got a clinical aim, but for the software, it seems like the purpose is regulatory and just to do with an efficiency. And the groups may vary from time to time, so it'd be much easier to sort of just, you know, the doctor can keep requesting their standard group, and then somebody else redefines what that group means. So there's an efficiency going forward in terms of, and there's always new tests. Every year there's new tests, and there may be changes in the grouping. But that was an aim of the Medicare review, to create a sort of a clinically agreed grouping, an efficient grouping that can be requested and rebated and carried out. And I think that's what I hope I've not gone on. I think that's what we're talking about, the purpose of the group compared to the purpose of the individual test.
Yeah, you raise an interesting issue though, because we've got the concept of group as a structural mechanism within the electronic order, and then we've got group as a new code, like a new SPIA requesting code, which then is a set itself. So you've got these two kind of abstractions of group. But I think for the, you know, the purpose of a FHIR implementation, the group in this sense is now that it's represented as an independent resource or independent piece of data, you can now hang things off the group without needing to replicate those things off the individual children. So one of the purposes of this is, I think, is just a pragmatic vehicle to carry shared information that you want to overlay on the children. So that's I guess my way of looking at it. Rob, I thought I saw your hand up.
Yeah, look, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. I just wanted to sort of echo what Ken was saying, but from the places side, the requesters side, you know, the groups, from our perspective, there's two issues with grouping of pathology tests. One is whether it's Medicare rebatable, but that's more an issue at the fulfillers side. But then there's the issue of reasons for testing might be, as Ken said, antenatal group, or maybe a group of tests that are related to thyroid testing, or another group that might be related to rheumatoid or inflammatory markers. So the ability for I just want to make sure that this isn't going to limit the way we in our own software can form groups of tests that we want to ask to be done to manage a certain condition. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to interfere with the software development at the clinical information system requesting end.
Yeah, that's a good point. And no, I don't think that's what we're looking to achieve at all. How the clinical information system overlays its kind of user interface with this structure shouldn't take away from any local means of what do we call them, whether it's shortcuts or the groups that you might create in a local sense.
Yeah.
It's just giving it a vehicle to represent those sets. The question is, for things like, if you decide, for instance, that you want to include some particular clinical information, and it's only relevant to one of the tests, not all of the tests, do you associate that information just with the single service request, or do you associate it with the group? And does that association with the group then imply some obligation that those who are receiving the request should be taking that clinical background into association with all of the tests? Maybe that's just a subtle difference. But what we have ended up doing previously is we kind of end up just repeating the same information for every test, because we had nowhere to put common information. And so I think the question last week we had was more around the fulfillment and the relationship between the group fulfillment versus the individual fulfillment. But on this placer side, it's in response to Michael's question about what's the purpose of this. In some ways, I think the initial purpose is a structural purpose. It's simply to say, when we create orders now, if you look at the current form, that clinical information is not associated with individual tests. It's actually associated with the entire order. So when you're writing your clinical notes, you're not necessarily going, only read this clinical note for this particular test. That's not the way it works. Michael.
Yeah, on that though, I think what you're talking there about is there's a place to put common data for the entire order is what we're talking about here. I think one of the problems though with using the same structure for both the individual tests and the order as well is exactly that source of truth problem, right? Is that I can have details in both the group and for the service request itself. And what's the relationship between those two? Is one providing additional clarity? Has one replaced the original one? There's a slight difference.
That's the guidance I think we have to think through, and we can certainly place constraints around this, so that if you're providing information in the group, then you cannot provide the information in the individual tests, and if you provide individual test information, you cannot provide it in the group. I mean, there's all sorts of constraints we can overlay on this to make that much more direct and understandable.
Does it overcomplicate it though? Is there a problem with the data repeating at a technical level in the structure?
There is,
because the test will be processed separately, or the service requests will be processed separately.
They won't though. They'll be processed as a whole.
I have these problems with what we're doing already. So things like clinical notes are repeated in all the tests. So there might be clinical notes, patients HIV positive, and blah, blah, big phrases about clinical notes. And at the moment, they're repeated on every test item, even though they're not related to the test item, they're related to the patient. And then as a receiver on my side, I'm just trying to get the clinical notes for the group. And so I have to now inspect all clinical notes, check that they're all equal to each other. And if they aren't, then I sort of have to deduplicate and work out which ones are unique in order to create one set of clinical notes for the request. And that's just a limitation on our receiving side, because we don't expect clinical notes per test item. We expect the clinical notes for the requests.
But if you allow notes at the individual test, you would have to do that checking anyway, because you can't rely on what the placer has, how their systems work and how is it populated it. It could duplicate them still.
But I can then at least say I take the group clinical notes and then I just append all the test clinical notes. Now, if the creators of the clinical notes want to duplicate the clinical note they put on all the childs, then I'd kind of point the finger at them and say, well, you make clinical notes ugly on our side for no good reason. If it's the same clinical note for the whole request, then put it up at the top level. But it makes my processing easier on my side, because now I just take the group clinical notes and then append below it any clinical note found on any test. And if in the future we get better and we can somehow arrange on our side clinical notes per test, then there it is. It's already spelt out. But it's kind of not what happens today.
Danielle?
I think we need to be careful here, especially around this use of common and using that phrase and saying the common things go in the grouper and don't go in the individual, because FHIR is a denormalized implementation model. So anything that applies across all the tests does need to be on the individual ones. So, I mean, the obvious thing there is patient. You can't just put patient at the request group and not have the patient on the individual ones. There is no implication in FHIR that the group in and of itself applies across all of those elements. I think that does lead to those very interesting questions about clinical notes. But I do want to caution that we don't make an assumption that because we've decided we have this conceptual thing that's a group, that we can therefore just structure it that way in FHIR and it will really mean that.
It's an interesting one because I mean, just
disagree.
the one that goes against that is the request group, because it actually overlays semantics on the statuses, for instance. That's a bit.
But that's a FHIR resource that is specifically designed to do that, which is I guess that taking that structural meaning in. If we're adding in and deciding that a FHIR structure, when not defined that way by FHIR, means something that's quite dangerous, and we need to think about that.
And we are creating the request group is not just a request. It actually has different semantics than the individual tests. And I think that's one of the differences in Australia. For us, request group or order is actually an entity on its own that has regulatory foundations that are not easily captured in the de facto kind of approach of FHIR at that individual service request level.
I'd also make the comment that diagnostic report in FHIR, which has a list of observations, suffers exactly the same problem. So diagnostic report likes to have a conclusion comment for the report about the multiple observations the report's talking about. I don't disagree with you, Jenny. I agree 100% what you said, but the rule seems to be broken by FHIR itself.
David.
Good morning, everyone. I guess just observation from sort of my experience working with one of the larger providers. I think something that commonly happens, and I'm not going to try and answer this question directly, but I'm just going to make an observation about the way that testing is done that I think has bearing on it. So Ken mentioned this when he was talking, that all of the tests that come in on a single request are often broken up and sent to different departments within a single laboratory. So information about the patient will often need to go multiple different places, and it should be perfectly duplicated to all of those places. But further complication is what happens if the request comes to a laboratory that is not accredited to do all the testing that's requested on that request. So what will happen often is the laboratory that receives that request will do the testing that they're accredited for, and then they will send away the testing that they can't do to a lab that is accredited. So there needs to be an easy way to, if you like, create a child request or, duplicate that information and send it on to somewhere that's completely outside of your organization. So as I said, I don't know what that means for sort of how you structure this in a sort of data and software design sense. But I think if you think about it that way and being able to do that, then hopefully that helps answer your question.
So we, from the outset, have not had that use case in scope. So the sending of interlab sendaways, where the request comes in for the doctor, it has a number of tests on it, and it has some weird tests, Ebola, and our lab doesn't do Ebola. And we manage internally that we're going to send that to some state lab who's going to do the test for us. They then send the results back to us, and then we send the results back to the doctor. That workflow of ordering the Ebola alone to the state health lab, we hadn't put that in the scope of this project. And that's not to dismiss it, you calling it out as a way of thinking about this, but I'm just highlighting we're not trying to solve the interlab ordering problem, but it still has merit, what you're saying, like, because, you know, that's maybe we should be, you know, and is breaking a request up valid use case for us to support. I'm not sure. But it's true that in HL7 version 2, the clinical notes are repeated per OBR. They're in OBR 13. So there is no, you know, group level clinical notes in a HL7 version 2 message.
So
against having a group, but
the other comment I would make about clinical notes is, in a sense, there's two types. There's one which is patient information, and then there's one that's specific to do with that particular test and or that particular method and or that particular result. So who are you trusting to work out which category particular information belongs into?
well, it has to be the filler. Sorry, the placer. Like, the lab can't. We're here to make a standard to make those rules, but of course it's the placer who puts the content in.
That's right. So I guess the question then is, you know, what happens if there's something that really should be considered patient information that is important clinical context potentially for other tests that gets recorded as test-specific information and then therefore not shared? Or do we not care about that? Do we share all information and treat it all as just patient information?
I think in the sharing, like breaking a request up into subcomponents and sharing with other entities, I think what we're proposing here is the group service requests would go along, right? Like, if I'm going to take my example where there's an Ebola and a full blood count liver function test, and we're going to do the liver function test and the full blood count, but we're going to send the Ebola somewhere else. If that's what we're going to do, we'd be breaking it apart. Just like we would be sending the patient with that request, we would also send the group service request. The group service request doesn't say do a liver function, do a full blood count. It just says there is a group. It consists of now one, the Ebola, and there's this group level comment that says this patient is HIV positive or whatever it says, that's at a group level. So I think the rule would be, if you're breaking apart, just like you would send the patient, you would send the group level service request as well, unchanged. The only thing you're changing is it has less children now.
And I don't think I don't think the concept is breaking up this request. It's actually deriving a new request that is then of a different type. It's a particular derived request which references back to the original request. So I think there is, in the FHIR sense, there are different ways of doing this than maybe the way we've traditionally done this potentially. Barty.
Hi, sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. I just wanted to say something about the clinical notes. Can't the clinical notes be defined at the group level, and if there is something specific at the test level as well, or is it always at the test level?
Well, we haven't set a rule around that, so I guess it's all up to us. And in fact, I guess in some ways this reminds me of sorry to bring it up, the must support kind of discussion, is that I do wonder that in some of these, the less, unless we know a lot more about it, then it would be probably wiser to err on the side of being less constraining until we have some precedents to set that there is a particular way of doing it. So if you are always aware that you might end up with just a lot of repeated stuff across different notes, or someone might particularly use the purpose of the group note, and if we describe that as being that it's applicable across all tests within the group and then individual tests, and the guidance there is that it's to put information in there which is more specific to the test for that particular test, then you as a filler in receiving that would then have to appropriately manage it. It may be that some take quite a simplistic approach, as maybe Angus does, appends it all together and then extracts the redundancy, and that's what goes into the system. But I think that's it's something that we probably don't want to cut off too early in our understanding. Ken.
I'm sorry. I think at the moment we can't assign, reasons or billing or statuses to individual tests requests. There's no software that I know. I mean, even the software that we've got, the clinical decision support, if a doctor orders a group and then a test, and the test requires some further clinical information to be provided for that test to be performed, that further clinical information is attached to the whole order. There's no way of untangling whether that information was triggered by the individual test or the other groups and everything. So at the moment, there's no way of doing that. But going into the future, we must be able to assign, to create at that test level, the justifications and the statuses and so on. So I'm not quite sure how we bridge that gap. And the only way I can imagine it is that in the first instance, we mainly have clinical notes associated with the group or the request. But in the future, particularly when we've got sort of a truly interoperable system, when a filler receives a request, they should be able to query the via interoperability and get the justification for that request specifically, not to the group, not anything else. So in the future, we must be able to have, at the moment, we're just assuming that whatever applies to the group or the request applies to the test. But if we can sort of say that we're going to reserve that test level, the deeper level, to provide further detail. So we can continue to assume that what applies to the group applies to the individual tests, but we can add extra information to the tests, which gives the detail. And that may also apply to the filling. Like, so with the group, let's say the group is incomplete. That's the status of the group, is it's incomplete. But drilling down to the tests, you might be able to see, well, these are the 4 tests that are complete, and this is the one that's incomplete. But at this stage, we may not have that level of we just only provide the information that the whole group is incomplete. But and so let's just carry that example through. So are all of the individual tests incomplete, and some of them are complete? So it's hard to create that repetition without creating conflict and redundancy. So but we have to be able to provide that extra information. So we do reserve it to the point at which our systems can provide individual test clinical details, and we reserve that system only for that excuse for the future world. Or do we make the assumption now that whatever applies to the group applies to the individual test, which is what we're currently doing?
I mean, it's a good point, Ken, and I think that we have to be quite careful about designing a future that is that carries the constraints of the past. So and I think this is a confusion a lot of people have, is when they look at the interoperability spec, they immediately see all of those features having a one-to-one match into their existing clinical information system, and that's not necessarily going to be the case. One of the benefits of using FHIR as an intermediary in the relationship between kind of the placer and the filler is that there could be more sophisticated features that the intermediary could support, but the initial adoption might be quite more staid, because there is not those features built into the user experience yet. But if they're allowed for by that FHIR server, then I think the clinical systems can grow as long as there's no misinterpretation. So for instance, as you say, maybe the initial systems are going to just put all the information into the group because that is the current semantics of how it's created, and maybe they'll grow into the more individualized information over time. we're just going to make sure that when you're pulling that information out from a filler perspective, that you are not going to miss information, and you are aware that information can be in the group, and the semantics of that are it applies to the whole order, and there may be information in the individual tests, and in that case, yes, they apply to that, but it may be that you consume it by raising that up into a whole of order piece of information. I don't know, you just have to, I think, be quite careful about walking that narrow pathway to not discount systems that can adopt more sophisticated features.
I think to Danielle's point about each thing being atomic, standing on itself, I think the fact that we have there's a based on reference back to the top service, to the group service request, surely that enables the child service request to stand somewhat alone, because you cannot consume a child service request without realizing it has a link to a based on group. So for someone to take the child out of the context of its group would be clearly doing that against, they would have to just completely ignore the fact that the child they're addressing has a reference to a higher level service request. I kind of feel that you feel, Danielle, that at least is the crumb trail on the child that's saying, this is based on something else. So you cannot just ignore the something else.
I think that might be too optimistic, because the something else can be a service request, but it can also be a care plan. It can be something else, and it doesn't imply that, for example, you won't have changed values, and that's meaningful to have done so. You might have, due to some other circumstance, gone, well, actually, here's what really needs to be ordered, and yes, it's based on that other thing, but it doesn't mean a straight inheritance.
But I mean, we have subject, which is the patient. It could be a group, it could be a location, it could be a device. How is that any different? Like, we can't just take a service request and you could say the same arguments with the patient of the service request. It's not listed in the service request. There's a reference to it, but the reference is to many things. It might not be a patient, might be a group, might be a location, might be a device.
For the subject, well, I mean, yeah, and that is the device. So in that case,
I'm just sort of countering it.
Semantic relationship is defined by subject, and it would have to still be set in both of them. You can't inherit, although you would, because of how the based on relationship is defined in semantics, that they would obviously be for the same patient. But it doesn't imply, I don't think, that all those values, like clinical notes, for example, do apply.
But does the patient apply?
I think it does. It would be hard for me to, the same way, even if it was a care plan, to say that for a care plan for this patient, well, actually, no, it doesn't. The subject could be different.
If I'm reading a service request, surely the patient applies, right? Like, it would be insane to say this service request is irrelevant to its patient. Like, the patient is a critical part of the service request, and the service request points to that patient. And then I can't see that being different to this service request also has a thing called based on. And so that based on is also critical to this service request. You can't just ignore it, like you can't ignore the patient.
But the patient could be different between the service request and the group.
It could.
But through error.
Yeah, I'd struggle to think why, but I understand that notion.
I can. There are some circumstances around, depending on where you're dealing and how you're dealing with tests related to, I guess, childbirth, pregnant women, and how the systems are handling that. But I think yes, we would expect the patient to be the same. But even if we expect it, it does have to be stated in both the service request this is based on and in the current one. You do have to restate it that fire is denormalized.
I don't know if I agree in general that that's a concrete across everything, because obviously there's a degree of denormalization that occurs as well. So I mean, this is something quite fundamental because of the role of the group within Australia. Within the Australian context of requesting, the group has a role above and beyond that which was originally supported by fire. And I think that I guess my thinking, because of the deep fundamental foundation of this within regulation, policy and funding, that we cannot have the group as a second-class citizen. So it needs to carry a meaning with itself. How much of that information, what's the requirement to allow the individual tests in an interoperability sense to live in isolation? And should they be used in isolation in an interoperability sense? Not to saying within an organizational context, you may rip all of this apart and and merge it all back together so everything is individual. But in terms of interoperability, are there circumstances where an individual test, pathology test, is actually going to be shared between organizations without an associated group carried with it? Now, when we're doing reporting, for instance, the report is going to reference the group. It's not going to reference the individual service request. So again, I don't know if we're going to get the answer to this. What I would like people to do, though, is to think about, I guess, a number of different options that we have. Is one that we are not prescriptive on the information held within the individual test versus the group. We try to do a halfway house, that there is a set of attributes that we steer towards the group and steer away from the individual test, or there's a set of information that we steer away from the group and we encourage it to be in the individual test being specified. I don't know if I'm there's an argument for this hierarchy independent of some of that, simply by the fact that, for instance, I guess making the argument around, say, Rule 3 exemption, Rule 4 exemption, now I'm getting confused, does it always apply to the whole order, or is it one where you apply it to a test and you have other tests there which are outside of the exemption? And that's normally, but I don't know now whether it's done separately, so you would do two different orders.
Yeah, I mean, Rule 3 exemption is to a test. We don't Rule 3 exempt the entire request of all its items. It's intended to be for a particular item number and therefore tests somewhat. And again, does it therefore live at the parent or the child? And I think it should live at the child, but backwards compatibility, you could still have it at the parent, implying something on this request is Rule 3, and that's being vague. You're then not saying, is it the INR that you want Rule 3? Like, it would be better at the child, but a bit like clinical notes, can you have it on both? Like, yeah, put it on the child, and it's really clear that this INR is Rule 3 exempt, right? But if you're unable, you're going to say this request is Rule 3 exempt, and then it's vague. What on the request? Like,
the entire
clinical notes is more flexible like that, but Rule 3 exemption, I think, it really is a child element. Sorry.
The entire request is Rule 3 exempt. It's not relevant for testing. It's only relevant for Medicare.
But when we have a Rule 3 exempt request that says INR full blood count liver functions, they're not saying the liver functions and the full blood count are Rule 3 exempt because they can't be. It's Rule 3 exempt for the INR.
But it doesn't make any difference to the testing that's done by the provider. It only makes a difference for what Medicare pays.
Yeah, but the requester has to state Rule 3 exemption. Like the lab can't make it up.
Yeah, the request is what is endorsed Rule 3 exempt.
It's a test on the request.
Nothing to do with the testing.
No, but it's got to do with, if I gave you a request for full blood count liver functions and INR, and I said Rule 3 exempt, does that mean you can redo the full blood count and liver function over and over and over?
Are you going to not do it based on the Rule 3 status? I just think your question is irrelevant.
So should Rule 3 exemption be
get endorsed as Rule 3 exempt? That's what it's written on the request form. That doesn't make any difference to the testing that's done. If you're doing the INR process at the lab is exactly the same, regardless of whether Rule 3 exempt is written on the request form or not.
I understand that. I'm not saying we're doing any different testing. I say that when we're claiming to Medicare for this request with 3 order items on it, it's not the Rule 3 that's Rule 3. It's not the liver function full blood count that's Rule 3 exempt. It's the INR, isn't it? It's the claim, I suppose.
Yes.
And you can't claim a full blood count Rule 3 exempt. It's not allowed. It's implied that it's the INR that we're Rule 3 exempting. I'll have to go dig in, but you can't. I'm not sure at what in the Medicare claim against MBS. Are you claiming at the item number level that this is Rule 3 exempt, or are you claiming at the claim level this is Rule 3 exempt?
Items are what are on the exemption list, and items are not the same as tests.
I realise. So am I claiming for like 10 items and just at the top level saying Rule 3 exempt? And then Medicare's determining which of these items I'm allowed for Rule 3 exempt.
For Medicare, you need to tell Medicare that the request was endorsed Rule 3 exempt.
Not the item.
Well, Medicare works all that out. But you submit that information with the entire claim. So the Rule 3 exemption status applies to the entire claim.
And they work out which one it's actually applied to. No. Yeah, I won't deny it. I don't know. I'd have to go check.
No, they apply it to the entire claim.
So is that saying that you're saying then that we should restrict the Rule 3 exemption to the group?
The Rule 3 exemption belongs to the request.
Sorry, I missed it. The
Rule 3 exemption belongs to the request.
Yes, but only
the request form, and the Rule 3 exemption belongs to everything that's written on that request form.
right. So we're just trying to translate this into a digital world. So we've got 2 pieces we can play with. One is we can attach, let's say we can attach information to the whole set of individual test requests, or we can place them on an individual one. And I think what you're saying is it needs to go on the whole rather than the piece. And in that case, I guess the argument that we're trying to get to is it something we should impose that as a constraint, that you can't put a Rule 3 exemption onto an individual test, and therefore you have to put it onto the group structure?
Well, it has to be added at the request level. So it doesn't make any sense to add a Rule 3 exemption to one test on a request.
Does anyone disagree that we shouldn't then apply it to the group?
Because it's got to be written on the request form by the clinician who's requested the tests.
I'm just unsure.
That's just the current system. But the proper system is that it's attached to the test it's relevant to.
Exactly.
At the moment,
it's on the individual order.
It's on the individual request.
The current system is that we can't attach it to the test, but in the future systems, it should be attached to the request.
Correct.
It would seem to make
Sorry.
better semantic sense. But for some
But
of
you
these
often
things,
see you often see people write on the form. They literally write rule 3 INR, like they like prefix the INR rule 3 INR. I'm not denying that. And I don't know down at the Medicare claim transaction level whether it's against the item number for the INR or whether it's against the request. And David's obviously saying it's against the group. But it's true from the Medicare rules that Rule 3 exemption only applies to certain items, not all items. And I wonder if it's just a lack of granularity in our current systems that you can't associate it to the test, and you just write it on the form. And a doctor could write a list of tests out and then just write in the top corner, Rule 3 exempt, and like you work it out, or they might write Rule 3 INR. I think I've seen both.
And that sort of concept, though, Angus, that sort of concept also applies to your clinical notes, does it not? Because one would say, have a whole group of tests on an order and then say, I don't know, let's think of something that is pertinent to a drug level, for example.
Yeah.
A clinical note that is pertinent to a drug level. I
agree. And so I'm sort of in the camp of we have both locations, right? So you could write up the top, patient is HIV positive, and then you could write down next to the, I don't know, I'm struggling with your example too, like glucose, patient is fasting or patient should fast. And to me, that's the power. We should allow the power to put them at the test level and put them at the group level. And then at the receiver's side, I'm just going to collate them. I'm just going to say, here's the group level comments and here's the child level ones. And I'd have to prefix them. I'd have to say, INR test, this note, full blood count, this note. But that's a flexible mechanism going forward. But today, in our sort of dumbed down world, they might put all those notes into the top level. They might write in the top level note, glucose test will be fasting, right? Now they're talking about one test and they put it in the top level, but that's kind of works because I'm just going to collate them together. And in the future, you'd like to think their system allows them to click on that test that they're ordering. And there's some options like provide note, and they can type literally against that test. But that's a future capability we allow by having this structure. It doesn't mean you must do it. It just means the capability's there.
It is what we're then saying for now, for our one where we do not become prescriptive of, and there is only one way you can do this, that instead we allow for the group-based and we allow for individual, and we leave it up to the exercise, to the placer and the filler to appropriately process that however they see fit.
I think if you're talking about clinical notes, that might be the case, but I don't know if that's the case for everything. As per our Rule 3 discussion, right? Like it's still clear. Do we say Rule 3 exemption must be at the test level, or Rule 3 must be at the top level? Clinical notes, it's kind of obvious that we can't say it must be at one or must be the other. It's going to be, you can provide notes at both levels. Please do it correctly, but there's going to be other scenarios, and I'm not saying Rule 3 is dead, but Rule 3 is a sort of good example where we as a group might decide, no, it must be at this level and only this level because it makes no sense at some other level. So to me, it's a per concept decision where we have to say, does this make sense at both levels? Does this only make sense at the parent level? Does it only make sense at the child level?
So for instance, something like fasting, does it make any sense to talk about fasting at the individual test level?
It does.
But
some tests require the fasting and others don't necessarily.
But if you is that because your single order is that you're actually going to are you going to do all of it at once, or are you going to come and go in terms of
We don't know. We don't
the
know.
collection?
So to put that's kind of a point. If you put it at the parent level, say, patient must fast. If they come in and need a fasting glucose and a urine, and they come in and go, I can't do the urine now, but I've fasted and I can do the fasting glucose. So they're going to take the blood, and then they're going to come back next week to provide the urine. Are they going to say, have you fasted for this urine? It's like, I don't need to fast for the urine.
So we're coming into time, and we do have some things that we need to do for the last 5 minutes. So I just want to call that out for us. If there's other topics or things that we need to go through in this discussion, setting it up for, I guess, Tuesday, our next meeting.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, this was one of the topics we wanted to talk about. What I like, I guess, is and maybe Zulip is the right place for this. Maybe I'll start something there, but I'd like to get some more commentary around this. We have a whole bunch of things we could do and tools we could apply, but I think it's important that we don't kind of overstretch if we're not in agreement. And I'd feel more comfortable in being less restrictive at this point than more restrictive. That's just my take on it. So I'll create something around the service request side. This is kind of obviously the mirror image of the task group and the task. And as was raised the other week, as Telstra Health said, we've got similar issues around what information should we keep in the individual task versus the group task. What is the constraint or relationship, for instance, that we want to apply with statuses? So we talked before around individual statuses versus the group status, the interpretation someone who receives this and reads it should make associated with that. We do need to be, if not prescriptive, at least descriptive of the intended use, so that it's clear to everyone that there is a pathway that is intended to be followed in this use. I don't think we're going to have a lot of time to go into these other ones. I'll just kind of pick off a couple of them. MHR consent, my health record consent withdrawal wasn't a list of things to be done. This is a proposed approach in R4 to doing this. Please have a read of that. I don't know if it's that controversial unless you have some structuring or assignment of the attributes, if some guidance around that. One thing I would note to you though is just be aware that consents have a link from the consent to the thing that you're consenting about. So it's not that the service request is linking to the consent, it's the other way around. Just keep that in mind. So we've got an example of my health record consent withdrawal. I've also put in there some communication request approaches. So this is for urgent communication, which again was one of those features that we talked about. I think next time we need to have a discussion around copy to and communication requests, because I think Chris raised a point about it, suggesting maybe we should not be using copy to, but instead go directly to communication request. I think we do need to get everyone on the same page when it comes to what the purpose of it is and what the intention within a FHIR context of that is. But please have a look at the communication request used for urgent results. I don't know if I put in the constraint around only applying that to an urgent service request, but that would likely go in there as well. I have put the foundations of a specimen link reference in there because that was in the data, the clinical data requirement that we were provided. So there is the minimum of that specimen reference for what met the need that was described. So have a look at that one.
I think
There is
maybe,
also-
Andy, we're sort of running into how much we might actually go through in
Yeah.
the next meeting.
Yeah, no, you're probably right in that. So it's probably going to mean that we're 2 meetings away from any kind of, voting on this stuff. But maybe don't think of this as an absolute, but at least making sure we get the right resources in play, and then we can have some more arguments around the attributes of them.
So we're saying, so next meeting, and we're about to, I guess, agree on when that confirm what the meeting time is and the agenda is that we're going to sort of temporarily put down the request group discussion maybe, and what we're going to do is do a walkthrough and a focus on the consent withdrawal. And I think the other one you mentioned was about the urgent contact.
Yep.
And so we'd like everyone to review those and also bring their requirements. What do they need in order to that Tuesday meeting, so we can see if we can go through and get a shared position and where we don't agree. Is it worth considering, because I know we are doing here on consent withdrawal, is I don't think that's specific to e-requesting. So I think it will be good to talk about it on Tuesday, but I think to come to an agreement, we also probably then want to see if we can talk it through in some of the other use cases.
Yeah, it makes sense to raise it up to AU core.
All right. Any questions from people on what we're going to try to cover in our next meeting, and any comments or questions on how to prepare for that?
Danielle, there's some in the chat.
Which one, Michael? For the next
Can we
meeting?
discuss?
There was specimen, I think.
Yeah, in the near future.
Yeah.
Yep, Andy's replying to that, to look at that on feedback, and then if we're ready, I guess we could also table that for the following meeting. So our next meeting being on consent and urgent contact, and unless there are any objections to it, we could table the specimen for the one after that. All right. So sorry, Angus.
I was saying that the specimen in the chat, the specimens come from the discussion about where to put things on groups and child, because they were talking about fasting status, and then someone said, well, that's a specimen property, and then so now we're talking about specimens.
All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and just to finish off for today is just going through our meeting cadence. So we are still trialing this weekly meeting, and that means that our next one would be next Tuesday on the 14th. And then into the 23rd and the 28th of May. Just want to reconfirm with people, are we happy to proceed trialing this cadence in May? There was a query raised about the MSIA meeting, potential clash on the 28th at 11 a.m. And if that meant that we wanted to cancel that one and only have two more meetings in May. So just leave that. Does anyone want to change these meetings? Are we happy to commit to this?
That's good.
All right. no one's objecting. So we're going to go forward with these May meetings. Hang on, there's something in the chat just in case. Oh, one person can't make the 28th of May. All right. And then in June, if we keep going with our weekly cadence, and we should reassess at the end of May as well and confirm that these June meeting times are appropriate. And yeah, so that's what our current cadence is looking like.
Even saying
Right.
there's a H7 working group on the 23rd of May.
Yep.
I think it's a different conversation as to we have a cadence. We're looking for a weekly cadence. I'm sure that cadence is going to bump into meetings along the path. But does that mean we don't have a weekly cadence?
I think we're probably not going to be able to have something that always means that there's no conflict for anybody. But if there is several of the TDG members propose as something different, or it's running into a majority conflict, then we should shift or cancel. All right, so that's that for today's meeting then. Thanks everyone, really good discussion. So we're going to keep that going in our next meeting. Don't forget we're going on those 2 topics. Have a look through the FireIG. Consider those 2 proposals and whether or not you think that there are alternatives, what we need to consider and how we can go through those. And I'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.